Well, first of all, thank everyone for coming out on a chilly Tuesday evening here in Chicago. Of course, I guess being chilly in Chicago is almost synonymous, right? So I wore a warm woolen suit as a consequence, anticipating precisely that. And I want to thank especially Jennifer Pritzker and the museum staff for bringing me here this evening and allowing me to talk to you. And I'll try to make this as interesting as possible for you because it's an important subject. War is something that Americans remarkably pay very little attention to. Oh yes, we have lots of interesting things on the History Channel. We have lots of popular narratives of past battles and wars, but we rarely dig into them to try and understand what really happened. So this evening I'm going to talk to you about not just 5 battles, each one is important in the context of the war, but also about the longer term implications for us in the 21st century. It's very important that we take seriously some of the insights that are in Margin of Victory because they need to shape our force structure in the future. Now every book has its own story, its own destiny, and this one is no exception. This originated, the ideas that is for the book, in 1991. And it came late in the evening on 1991, February 26, about 11 p.m. I looked out across this battlefield where I could see fires burning for miles in every direction and destroyed equipment. And I waited for the 1st Infantry Division that was behind us to move up through the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment and my squadron, the 2nd Squadron. And it suddenly dawned on me that this had been the contemporary equivalent of a battle of annihilation. We hadn't simply won a battle, we had annihilated the enemy. And I wondered, how had this happened? I mean, naturally, we all stand back and we want to congratulate ourselves on all the brilliant decisions we made in action that obviously explain the outcome. But ladies and gentlemen, a lot of decisions were made decades before I showed up on that battlefield that resulted in the organizational structure in which I was serving, decisions about the human capital, the people that would show up and fight with me, decisions about the equipment, and where this organizational construct and its equipment fit into a much larger picture. And I began thinking then, how did we do it? How had we gotten this right? And what can we learn from it? So I tucked that away for many, many years, and I went to a presentation about another book on the topic of Calvin Coolidge. You know, the man who looked like he'd been weaned on a pickle and was noteworthy for not being one of the more popular presidents. And the author, Amity Shlaes, was discussing Calvin Coolidge's career and said that Coolidge had received a note from one of his friends in the Senate. And the Senate said, the senator said, "I'm appalled. One of the other senators had the gall to tell me to go to hell." And so Calvin Coolidge sat there, took out his pen, wrote out a note and said, "Senator, I looked up the law. You don't have to go." And he sent it back to him. And that was the moment I decided it was time to write Margin of Victory, because I had seen hell. Fortunately, I wasn't necessarily in it. Hell was on the other side of the battlefield, and it was behind me. It was the path of destruction that we had created across the desert in Iraq in 1991. And it became very important to me to write the book because avoiding that hell is really, to a large extent, what Margin of Victory is all about. Now, the first thing that everyone needs to understand are these 2 critical observations by Friedrich Nietzsche, the great German philosopher. The first one is important because it applies to everyone I talk about in this book. War makes the victor stupid. As I go through each of these chapters, the first one, which is about the British Expeditionary Force in 1914, the British had had no serious military confrontation since 1854. And really, people would argue that even that, as bad as it was still a minor event compared with what they'd been through fighting Napoleon. And the British had fought continuously for decades weak opponents, colonial opponents, people in what today we refer to as the developing world. And in each of these encounters, they were marvelously successful because it wasn't very difficult to mobilize superior firepower and utterly dominate your opponent. This was not just true for the British. This was the experience that the Japanese had later on with the Chinese. It's the experience the Germans had in 1940 against the French and the British, who turned out to be much less challenging than even the Germans had anticipated. And it is also the case with the Israelis in 1973, because the Israelis had fought in 67 and literally swept all of their enemies from the battlefield. And then finally, I go to 1991 to try and explain that our victory in 91 has really made us rather stupid. And the consequence of that stupidity is something that I discuss at the end. But the point that you need to remember is exactly what Nietzsche said: war makes the victor stupid. When you have a dramatic victory, you congratulate yourself, you walk away contented, convinced that you have the final solution for anyone else who dares attack you, and you are almost inevitably wrong. The second quote is equally important. Nietzsche said, "The history of mankind is the eternal returning of the same." Now, I know people say history is sort of like music or poetry. It doesn't always perfectly rhyme, but it's the same thing over and over again. This is a little more important for our discussion today. And let me give you a quick example. In 1623, a Persian Shiite army invaded what is today Iraq and seized control of Baghdad. They proceeded to expel all of the Sunni Arabs, Turks, and Kurds that lived in the city and turn it into a Shiite city as part of the Greater Persian Empire. In 1643, an Ottoman, Turkish, Sunni, Arab, and Turkish army returned, retook Baghdad, threw out all of the Shiites who were Turks or Persians or Arabs, and reinstalled the Sunni government and made it a part of the Ottoman Empire. Now, that's just part of the story. The wars that then proceeded from this particular event went on until the late 1840s. And finally, there was a resolution in the conflict between the Turks and the Persians. That resolution is today's border between Iran and Iraq. And that border was fixed by the Tsar of Russia, who was, in fact, allied with Iran. My point to you is that you turn on the television at night and you listen to various people in the news tell you, oh, this is breaking news. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no breaking news. It's the same old thing repackaged. And that's very important, because to some extent, that's war. You see the same kinds of things repeat themselves in new form with new technology. But again and again, we fail to learn the really critical lessons. There are 5 battles. These battles and these wars are different from the kinds of conflicts in which we have been involved over the last 15, 16 years. What do I mean by that? These are really wars of decision. This is what Clausewitz referred to as wars that decide outcomes, that have end states, that either resolve disputes, create new borders, new economic systems, new imperial systems. They have a specific impact that you can trace geographically, culturally, politically, and economically. Each of these wars had a profound impact, some more than others. We have been involved now for 15 or 16 years in what are the equivalent, frankly, of colonial conflicts. These conflicts have decided effectively nothing, because there was never any end state in mind. When we entered these conflicts, there was no one at the top who said, in 6 months or 6 years, this is what we will have at the end of our investment, at the end of our commitment. And as a result, they're open-ended. They decide nothing, but they also don't result in very heavy casualties. And casualties make a difference to liberal democracies. We are no exception. And the casualties we're going to talk about in these battles are profound. The first one, involving the British Expeditionary Force in 1914, that force suffered 15,000 casualties out of 80,000 men in 1 week. Imagine the impact here in the United States today of fighting over the period of a week that resulted in 15,000 casualties. I think the President and the Congress would have a lot to explain to the American people. The second battle, involving Shanghai, the Japanese sustained 40,000 casualties, the Chinese 270,000 over a period of 75 days. Incomprehensible today. The third one, over a period of 50 days, the Soviets sustained almost 450,000 casualties, the Germans 240,000. Then the Israelis and the Egyptians, in the space of about, I would say probably 2 weeks, the Israelis sustain about 7,000 casualties fighting the Egyptians. The Egyptians sustain over 30,000. And then finally, when you get to the Battle of 73 Easting, and that's really an event that is spread across 6 to 7 hours on the 26th of February, the Iraqis who are facing us in this Republican Guard brigade of some 2,300, they lose an estimated 1,700 killed. Not just casualties, dead. And another 400 or 500 survive to surrender. We sustain 7 casualties, including 1 killed and the loss of 1 armored fighting vehicle. So these are different from the kinds of events that we've seen over the last 15 years, and it's important that you understand that. Because the argument the book makes is that we are headed in the future, 10, 15, at the most 20 years from now, into another war of decision, a war that really matters. And it's the kind of war you don't want to lose, which will become increasingly obvious as we go through this. Every story has a person behind it. The notion that institutions, large armies, large navies, air forces, somehow or another manage to do things on their own or fix themselves is absurd. Behind every fundamental reform, every fundamental change that matters is a human being. And the men who are depicted on these slides exemplify that. The first one is Sir Richard Haldane. He's an interesting story because he had no military experience, and he ends up being appointed as Secretary of State for War, which is the equivalent of being the Secretary of the Army now, in the aftermath of the Boer War. And he walks in and he discovers that he has an enormous advantage despite the absence of military experience over the generals. He's read some books. The generals haven't. No one at the top of the British Army read anything. So Haldane, interestingly enough, is someone who spent 2 years of his life studying philosophy in Germany. So he is fluent in German. He reads all of the German works. He studies the German army. And he decides that the Germans offer the best model for the British Army, with the exception, of course, that he can't have a draft. So he builds a new force between 1905 and 1912. He takes this collection of regiments designed to suppress Zulus, Afghans, Pathans, tribal peoples in various parts of the empire, and tries to reform it into an army capable of continental warfare. Today we call that mid to high intensity warfare. In other words, to land somewhere on the European continent potentially and fight a major opponent. The man next to him is a gentleman named Ugaki. He was a career army officer. He also spent many years of his life in Germany. He returns to Japan, convinced that the Germans have the right solution, and he becomes the Minister of Defense. And he tries very, very hard to reduce the size of this mammoth Japanese army that had fought in the Russo-Japanese War, consisting of hundreds of thousands of riflemen, and turn them into a modern military force modeled on the German army, with the exception that this is now the post-war German army with tanks and aircraft and machine guns and artillery. He has some success, but not very much. And the reason he doesn't have very much success is that the emperor can't make up his mind. The emperor can't decide if he's right or wrong, and ultimately decides to do nothing. And so the Japanese army really doesn't change. They don't reduce and extract the savings that are necessary to fund the scientific industrial base that Japan needs to build a modern army. And then, of course, they go to China. We'll talk about that. And China creates the illusion of victory. And there is no fundamental change in the Japanese army until it's too late. And that is in 1943. And by then, the handwriting is on the wall. It's too late for Japan. The destruction of Army Group Center in June of 1944 is really the product of this Russian colonel. He's an interesting man because, you know, you hear about Bolsheviks and revolutionaries. This man is the son and the grandson of Tsarist army officers. He speaks, reads, and writes German quite fluently, along with Russian. He takes the time to study the Germans very carefully. When the war begins in 1941, miraculously, he escapes the Stalinist purges, and he rapidly advances simply because so many general officers were either being executed by Stalin or captured by the Germans that there were huge vacancies and upward mobility was dramatically enhanced. He gained a reputation for being what the French call a rocher du bronze, or Felsen de Brandung, as the Germans say, the granite in the fire, as someone unshakable nerve. He surfaces in 1943 after the fall of Stalingrad, and our friend Stalin wants desperately to launch massive assaults against the Germans. He wants to follow up. And of course, as some of you know, in the aftermath of Stalingrad, there's a counteroffensive which results in horrible destruction of Soviet forces. He stands in front of Stalin, who has already executed hundreds of general officers, and makes the argument, no, we must stand on the defense. We cannot attack the Germans. The Germans will still outmaneuver us and destroy us. We must stand on the defense, and we must allow the Germans to attack us on our terms. On either side are two Soviet marshals, Zhukov, Vasilyevsky. He is the director of operations and planning. And when Stalin finishes listening to this gentleman, he then turns to the other two marshals and he said, "What do you think?" And they say, "We agree with him." Of course, beads of sweat pouring down off their heads. They're all afraid to try to contradict Stalin. Ultimately, Stalin agrees, and you get Kursk. And exactly what this man planned is what happens at Kursk. The consequence is that after Kursk, you can imagine he is a hero. And he has Stalin's absolute confidence. He plans the destruction of Army Group Center. And he has at his disposal an army that was built for total war, and it's facing a German army that was really designed for very limited war, limited operations, principally in Central and Western Europe. Then we have our friend Anwar Sadat. He's enormously important to this story because Anwar Sadat is unlike almost anyone else I think we've ever seen in the Middle East. He's unique among statesmen. He is an experienced soldier. He served in the Anglo-Egyptian force before World War II and during the Second World War, although he was obviously extremely anti-British in his orientation. He took the trouble to study the Germans, but instead of trying to emulate the German military, which he admired very much, he concluded that's something that the Egyptian soldier cannot do. And so we see in Anwar Sadat someone who very carefully calculates the limits of his human capital. Remember that in 1973, only about 32% of his population could read or write. And he understands that you can expect only so much from soldiers that can't read and write. More importantly, you can only expect so much from people who are disinclined for cultural reasons to do anything unless they are told to do it. And so he plans an offensive in ways that are very reminiscent of Field Marshal Montgomery, who takes over the 8th Army, which is shattered from defeat after defeat after defeat, and he remolds the Egyptian army, and the result is this magnificent and effective crossing of the Suez Canal. And of course, at the same time, the Israelis, who have grown very overconfident, are surprised. And then we move into the 73 Easting, and we're dealing in the 73 Easting with two very different groups of people. We're dealing with an Arab force that's very similar to the Egyptian force. It's a force that can defend statically. It's not a force that can maneuver. It's a force whose officers, unfortunately, are never forward, always behind the soldiers. And as a result, it's not going to perform up to Saddam Hussein's expectations. But Saddam Hussein had seen his forces in the Iranian-Iraq war, and he had seen the Iranians mount mass charges with thousands upon thousands of infantrymen and a handful of tanks, and he watched as his forces were able to destroy them and concluded that he had a force that was second to none, that his force could even take on the United States. And at the same time, facing him on the battlefield is an army that just 15, 16 years earlier was virtually in ruins, demoralized, fallen completely apart in the aftermath of Vietnam. And this force is then reorganized, reformed on the old 1942 model, but given new equipment, a new training regimen, a new culture, if you will, with soldiers who are not draftees. Soldiers, sergeants, lieutenants, and captains who are actually professional soldiers. And this force is a force that Saddam Hussein could never have anticipated, and it's a force that turns out to perform vastly better and beyond the expectations of senior officers who are Vietnam veterans and think exclusively in terms of Vietnam. The BEF in 1914. Today, it's hard for us to imagine that there was ever a British Army that looked like the BEF of 1914. This was a force that was built to do more with less. This was a force that had to recognize that it was always second or third in line after the Royal Navy. Clearly, if you're in Great Britain, you put your money into the Navy. You want to make sure no one can cross the channel. You think very little about the Army. But Haldane recognized that he only had so much in terms of funds that he could invest, so he would make the most out of it. And he recognized the importance of human capital, developing, educating, cultivating better soldiers that can read and write, soldiers that can think, officers that have to perform against some sort of standard. He does a pretty good job, but it's not enough, because he's still dealing with a senior officer corps that, let's put it bluntly, is where it is for reasons of social position and standing more than anything else. And this hurts the performance of the British Expeditionary Force in 1914. They go to Mons, there are 80,000 of them in 2 corps. They have no idea what they're facing because they can't see more than 3 or 4 or 5 miles. They have no idea that there are hundreds of thousands of German troops headed in their direction. And so the standard sort of British officer culture prevails. All orders have to be written. Verbal orders are out of the question. Everyone has to receive a written order, which of course makes no sense in the fluidity of combat. And then secondly, British commanders are very reluctant to specify and give detailed instructions. And so General Smith Dorrien, who is a very fine officer, turns to his officers because they are arrayed along a canal that's about 7 to 8 feet deep and 20 to 30 feet wide. And there are bridges over the canal. And he says, "Oh, of course, chaps, do be sure to blow those bridges when you think it's right to do so." I mean, incomprehensible. Bridges over a canal? Oh, you make the decision. In the German army, an order would have been issued that at precisely this time, every bridge will be destroyed and they would all vanish, but not in the British army. And as a result, when the Germans attack, there are bridges waiting for them that they can use. And so the battle turns out to be a lot tougher than the British anticipated. And here we see the beginning of modern intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and what I call strike, which is the ability to fire artillery or use aircraft beyond the line of sight. The British are excellent marksmen, they're tough infantrymen, they're putting up a great fight, and all of a sudden they look above and someone in an airplane is dropping various forms of colored smoke and ribbons out of the airplane. And they can't figure out what this is. And a few minutes later, enormous quantities of German artillery rain down on them. Well, the Germans are using radios. The Germans are marking targets. And the speed with which the location of the British units is being reported back to the artillery is in minutes. And the British suddenly find that they're being driven out. Well, the British artillery hasn't practiced indirect fire. Their experience in the Boer War and fighting, the fuzzy wuzzies, as they like to call them, was in direct fire. You lowered the guns and you blew away vast quantities of your enemies. Suddenly the Germans don't cooperate. So the British really aren't up to it. They do the best that they can, but they are driven back. And they start out by taking almost 2,000 casualties the first day, and by day 7, 15,000 have been taken, and whole units are facing annihilation. The good news is that the British sacrifice was not in vain. Their purpose there was fulfilled. They did slow the Germans. Not slow in the sense of completely disrupting the timetable, but they became appealing. They became this appetizing target, and the commander of the German First Army said, we've got to crush this British army. So keep up, and he ends up diverting many of his resources and his troops to chase the British 250 miles all the way to the Marne River. This is enormously helpful because the French are also able to put reserves in the center of their line. So in that sense, the sacrifice is worthwhile. But the tragedy is that the men in the British Expeditionary Force, 160,000 of them by October of 1914, are virtually all dead or wounded. And in the words of the historian, the British Army of the old empire passes forever into the history books. There was no one left. The British weren't prepared for that, and they paid a terrible price for not being prepared. And it would take years before the British could build up their armies. In 1914, all they could do was occupy a front of 20 miles. The French occupied the remaining 380. And that would not change dramatically until 1916. Chapter 2, the Battle of Shanghai. This is one of the most tragic battles that you can imagine. This is one where when you begin to study what the soldiers went through, Chinese and Japanese, you actually feel terribly sorry for what they encountered. It's far worse than anything the British faced in 1914. The Chinese are the epitome of a third world army. They have very few highly trained soldiers, well-equipped soldiers. The few that they have, sadly, are squandered in trying to defend Shanghai. And Shanghai is the key to Nanking, and of course in Nanking there is the capital of the Republic of China, Nationalist China, so Shanghai has to be defended. They lose 270,000 Chinese soldiers. We estimate 250 to 400,000 Chinese civilians die in this terrible battle. The Japanese are surprised, but again the Japanese have not fully modernized, but thanks to Ogaki, they do have tanks, they do have excellent air forces, new aircraft, but all of the problems that we see in subsequent wars start to manifest themselves at Shanghai. Halfway through the battle, to get the air forces in the army and the Imperial Japanese Navy to cooperate with the ground, the commanding general, Matsui, of the Japanese force has to sit down with the admirals and negotiate an agreement between the air forces and the ground forces, stipulating what the air forces will do for the ground forces and what they get in return for it. Imagine having to negotiate an agreement like that in the middle of a battle. But he does it, and it works. The air forces instantly want to fly inland and bomb cities, bomb airfields, which have absolutely no impact whatsoever on the outcome of the battle for Shanghai, which is critical. So he's got to bring them back. And they do that. He finally takes the 50 tanks that he's got and he puts them literally in the spearheads of his advancing forces. He links them to aircraft and he executes what we later call some form of blitzkrieg against the Chinese. And he's able to gain a lot of ground remarkably quickly. You would think that this had a profound impact. It doesn't. It wins the battle, it breaks through the Chinese, but the lesson of what has been done on the ground at Shanghai is ignored in the Imperial Japanese Army, and they go back to business as usual. And that's one of the reasons that the battle, instead of looking like World War II, tends to look a lot like World War I. And the other tragedy of this battle is that Matsui, interestingly enough, was a devout Buddhist who thought he was going to liberate China, not invade it. And he is later hanged for the atrocities in Nanking with which he had no direct contact. And he takes the blame because a member of the Japanese imperial family is actually the commander on the ground in Nanking, and they can't afford to execute a member of the imperial family. Japan doesn't change anything until 42 and 43. They go back to Minister of Defense Ogaki and they begin to implement his reforms from 1929, 30, and 31. It's too late. And ultimately, they pay a terrible price in 1945 when the Soviet armies, who are fully modernized and released from the West, come in and annihilate the Japanese forces in Manchuria and Korea. Army Group Center is extremely important for us today, those of us who are in uniform, because we see things that happen on the Soviet side that are evidence for what will dominate battlefields in the future. The Soviets do an excellent job of integrating intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance from the air, once again with their strike assets, their artillery, but this time, masses and masses of rockets, masses of guns, masses of aircraft are all organized and used as essentially a sledgehammer at will. And what's impressive about it is the speed with which the Soviets are able to mobilize this striking power and use it at will. And it wasn't until I had finished really all of my research looking at the impact of this operation on the development and command and control of Soviet forces that I realized how far behind we were in 1944 and 45 when it comes to these things. We had a situation not very different from the German armed forces under Hitler, with various commanders and various branches of the service fighting with each other for prominence, for control, for command, and for resources. All of that was completely absent on the Soviet side. And there's a reason for that. They very nearly lost their country completely. And so you get this absolute ironclad integration of everything from the top to the bottom. And you have one man in command at every level. So when, during the course of this battle, where you have 1.2 million Soviet soldiers just in the attacking echelon, there are 3 million, another 2 million behind them, but 1.2 million, these are tanks, assault guns, and infantry. When they attack, they have all of this firepower being marshaled at their disposal. Now, having said all of that, what's impressive about the battle is that on the day of the battle in June of 1944, there are only 110,000 German soldiers in the forward positions facing the Soviets. Well, what had happened? Well, Adolf Hitler, of course, had divined that there would be no attack there. He had said repeatedly it will come through the Ukraine, even though the Germans, from private all the way up through general, had repeatedly reported the buildup in front of them in White Russia. Made no difference. Hitler said, no, that's a feint. They're going to attack through Ukraine. The whole deceptive program did not fool anybody except Adolf Hitler. Everyone else knew exactly what was happening. I couldn't prove it, but when I went through the daily journal of the German General Staff, and especially for Army Group Center, I tried to find evidence for it. I couldn't find it, but I think that the commanders at the time in the field, who normally would have had about 300,000 to 400,000 troops at the time in Army Group Center, had decided that the disaster was coming. They wouldn't be allowed to reposition. They wouldn't be allowed to move their forces. And so I think they let a lot of people go home on leave, knowing full well that if they didn't, they were probably going to be killed. But the interesting part is that even though there were only 110,000 German soldiers in these forward defenses, ultimately the Soviets lose 440,000 men trying to break through them. And there you see once again the criticality of this human capital. The German soldier thinks. And when the German soldier sees that it makes no sense to be where he is, that he needs to move, he moves. His officers think. And as communications break down during the battle, the Germans actually begin to perform infinitely better. But of course their position is hopeless. They don't have the fuel for it. They can't keep a plane in the air for more than an hour or two. And the Soviets win a dramatic victory that puts them within 300 miles of Berlin, and in a position to seize Berlin far, far earlier than we could. The 73 War and the Israeli counterattack across the Suez. I told you earlier about Sadat's achievement, and it is a brilliant achievement that no one should undervalue. He got out of the Egyptian army more than anyone thought was ever possible. And when this battle ends and the Israelis have actually crossed the Suez Canal at multiple points, there are still almost 90,000 Egyptian troops holding fast in their defensive positions on the other side of the Suez. It is a marvelous achievement, but the problem is that the Egyptian can only defend statically. the Egyptian cannot maneuver, and the Egyptian cannot respond to what is unexpected. And the unexpected is exactly what the Israelis are extraordinarily good at. Because as you look at, just as the Germans could move and think and act and respond quickly, so too do the Israelis. And the battles that result in the crossing of the Suez are not won by the generals. Indeed, the generals do a fine job. They are won by the Israeli soldiers, sergeants, lieutenants, captains, majors, and lieutenant colonels, who die in great numbers, by the way, in massive tank battles. Tank battles involving hundreds of tanks on each side, sometimes firing at each other at almost point-blank range. But the Israelis prevail because they have this culture of innovation and improvisation. If it doesn't work, stop doing it and find another way. And that is the watchword inside the Israeli Defense Force. And they take terrible losses at the beginning because they were completely unprepared for this air defense umbrella over this enormous defensive position on the other side of the Suez. And as a result, they lose hundreds of tanks, they lose a lot of aircraft, they stop, they fall back, and they start talking about what has happened, and they begin to put together new tactics, new approaches that will work. And there's a wonderful example. One young battalion commander, he had about 300 men in his reconnaissance battalion. His name is Lieutenant Colonel Brome. Unfortunately, he did not survive the war. But once the Egyptians have established themselves, he manages to find a seam between two Egyptian armies. He moves down that seam all the way to the Suez Canal and finds a potential crossing site that is completely unoccupied. And he manages to get in and to get out without ever being detected. That turns out to be the game changer. That becomes the crossing site. That is where the Israelis concentrate their effort. The outcome, of course, is a dramatic crossing and the complete collapse of the Egyptian command structure, because the Egyptian command structure finds out 24 hours after the Israelis have actually crossed the canal that the Israelis are over the canal. They begin to get reports of tanks and long-range Israeli artillery destroying air defenses 24 hours after the Israelis have crossed. The lines of communication have completely collapsed. And when the Egyptian Air Force tries to intervene, of course, it's shot out of the sky. But the Egyptians make an interesting decision. They make the decision to stand firm, to hold what they've got. And that turns out to be a good decision, because once the conflict ends with the intervention of the United States and the Soviet Union, the Egyptians are able to hold on to territory and insist on the return of the Sinai. And the outcome is actually a very good one in the history of warfare, because both sides get something they wanted. The Israelis wanted a secure border with Egypt, and the Egyptians wanted the return of the Sinai for reasons of their national honor. So it's a very positive thing. The last battle, the 73 Easting. And I've got to tell you, the 73 Easting is an interesting one, because I think it shows the American soldier at his best. Just as we've talked about the brilliant performance of the individual German soldier, the Israeli soldier, the American soldier in the 73 Easting turns in an exceptional performance. And I want to give you a quick insight into the American soldier and his mentality. Shortly before we deployed to the border with Saudi Arabia and then began our invasion, if you will, of Iraq, we were much deeper inside Saudi Arabia, but we had sent one troop up to the border with Saudi Arabia and Iraq. This was called Ghost Troop, G Troop. There are some members of Ghost Troop in the audience, by the way, who were there with me. And Ghost Troop has the mission to defend this log base and to defend along the border. All of a sudden, I'm wakened. I think I was trying to get some sleep. It was in the evening, about 8 or 9 o'clock at night. And one of the NCOs said, the duty officer wants you to come over to the Tactical Operations Center right away. This is a couple of weeks before we actually went into Iraq. And I walked in there and I said, what's going on? And he said, well, the squadron's on alert. We have information that Ghost Troop is under artillery fire. I alerted regiment. Well, suddenly you had the entire 2nd Armored Cavalry Battle Group, which was about almost 5,000 in the regiment, plus a reinforcing artillery brigade, some 7,000. Everyone is up, everyone's mounted, vehicles are running, and into the headquarters, or this Tactical Operations Center, walks a non-commissioned officer. He happened to be my master gunner. And he said, "What's going on?" And so the duty officer said, "Sergeant, you know, we have a report here that says Ghost Troop is taking artillery fire up on the border with Saudi Arabia." And he said, "Oh, so we all want to rush right up there and get under it with them? That doesn't make a lot of sense." And of course, it didn't make any sense. So I said, "Well, wait a minute, show me the original report." And the original report came in as follows: "I have air-to-ground bombs at my location." So I thought, this is rather odd. I've never heard of bombs that did not fall from the air to the ground. Are there ground-to-air bombs? I've only heard of air-to-ground bombs. Well, you can bet what had happened. This poor guy, and this is, remember, people are nervous. Everyone's green. There's only one man in my 1,100-man battle group that had actually seen action in Vietnam, and he's my operations sergeant major, a tall, distinguished black man named Ketchings. None of us had really seen action before, and so it's natural. He had seen these flares coming out of A-10s that were flying over Kuwait and Iraq and Saudi Arabia, and he thought, well, these are bombs. And of course, they were there to confuse the enemy's air defenses. But that's the sort of thing that inevitably happens in every war. But the key thing here is that when we finally closed with the enemy, the level of training was excellent. The quality of the equipment was first rate, but the intelligence of the individual soldier was decisive. Units in battle have to be self-organizing. They can't be micromanaged. I know you've seen the movies, and you've seen somebody who sort of stands there and drops his sword and everybody attacks. Everything looks controlled. Forget it. Once you issue the order, advance, which I did, you're out of control. You have to depend on everyone at every level to think and execute the battle drill, execute the mission. And the one thing I did once we went into the attack was stop it at about 30 minutes, maybe 20 to 30 minutes into the attack. And the reason I stopped it was that I looked up and there was nothing there anymore to shoot at. And so then I began to worry, where are we? And so I got on, I said, battle stations, Cougar 3, halt. I say again, halt all operations. And so this juggernaut of 1,100 men, 42 tanks, 42 Bradleys, 8 guns, stopped. Boom. And then I said, find out where we are. Because it's a desert, you know, there are no road signs out there, there are little towns. And it took some time. This was the beginnings of global positioning satellites. A scout called in and said, these are the coordinates. And we discovered that we were about 7-4, eventually it was 738, almost 7-4, this north-south grid line. We at that point were about 4 kilometers, 2.5 to 3 miles beyond the limit of advance that the regiment had set for us. And subsequently I was told to withdraw, and I became very irate, refused to go back. The deputy regimental commander told me that we could stay. We stayed. So we struck an annihilating blow, and we discovered that this was the Republican Guard, but ladies and gentlemen, it was the rear guard, because we had been held back so long, for so many days, that the main body of the Republican Guard Corps, a force of over 80,000, had already left. They had escaped over the Euphrates. And instead of allowing us to pursue at that point, we were told, stand by and wait for the divisions to catch up with you. Of course, this is 5:30 in the evening, and the divisions did not begin to reach us until after midnight. And what they shot and what they found was, in most cases, abandoned equipment and very few troops. Because, again, the one thing that was important in this war, the Republican Guard Corps, the foundation for Saddam Hussein's regime, had largely escaped. And that's why this is called the lost victory. That's one reason. Because no one in Washington had thought carefully through this business of what's the purpose of the operation, how are we going to execute it, and what do we want it to look like when it ends. And that is the theme through all of these battles. No one bothers to sit down and systematically ask those questions. And when you fail to do that, you end up in places like Stalingrad, you look around and say, now what? What's the point? The Japanese ended up mired in China, and we ended up on the Euphrates River watching as the Republican Guard on the other side slaughtered the rebels trying to overthrow Saddam Hussein. The ceasefire comes along, and Norman Schwarzkopf, as I recollect, he said he had the IQ of a genius, wrote out the terms that he was going to impose on the enemy and sent them back to Washington. The State Department reviewed it, the Pentagon reviewed it, the White House reviewed it. No one changed a word. Nothing. He got no guidance. They said, that's fine. And of course, we know the rest of the story. The Republican Guard had not been destroyed. Saddam Hussein was not going to be overthrown. And so subsequently, President Bush then begins this process of encouraging Shiites and Kurds to openly rebel. And they are slaughtered in great numbers as a result. But the official story is we never meant to change regimes in Iraq. We never meant to remove Saddam Hussein. But at the end of the process, all of us said, in 12 years, we'll be back. But the bigger picture of what happens in Desert Storm is that suddenly this peace that you saw in 1914 with the Germans and the aircraft and the smoke and the connectivity back to the artillery now becomes a machine on a scale that we can't even begin to imagine. And that is what shapes the battle today. That is what shapes warfare today. It is this revolution of intelligence, surveillance, and strike, the marriage of the two. The rapidity with which that strike can be directed with absolute accuracy and precision on the basis of that information. And that changes everything. We have not faced it. We own it, but we are no longer the sole proprietors. That capability now also resides with the Russians, with the Chinese, increasingly with the Iranians, and we're going to see it proliferate in unmanned and manned form. So, there we have it in a nutshell. You all made it through this far, so I hope you have lots of questions. Thank you very much.
I would just ask a question about the British Army of 1914 made up of volunteers and the American forces of 1991, a professional army. How would you, well, of course, the Americans have the technology and so on. The British Army, once it was depleted at Marne in the early days of the First World War, could not be re-emplaced with such a well-trained troops, and they paid a price at, the Somme and Passchendaele. But how would you talk about the non-conscript, the professional armies of both of those times?
Well, that's a great question. First of all, in the first chapter, I do cover the experience of the Boer War, both because of some of the things that were learned and many of the things that were not learned. The British never faced more than 70,000 opponents in South Africa, most of the time about 30,000 in the field. Remember, the Boers were farmers, they had wives, children, families, and of course the British introduced to mankind the concentration camp that subsequently killed 78,000 women, children, and old men who were Boers, something for which the British Prime Minister Campbell Bannerman subsequently apologized in 1905. Much to the consternation of the British people who said that they would not apologize for anything. Sound familiar? They learned some things. They learned the value of aimed rifle fire. They learned the value of organizing permanent headquarters. In those days, headquarters were ad hoc. That meant that regiments were brought together, brigaded together, as they said. Then they would put together an ad hoc brigade headquarters, ad hoc division headquarters, and so forth. Those things are fixed, and fixed very, very well. But the problem is that that's about it. The criticality of artillery fire, particularly indirect artillery fire, is completely ignored. Even though they've got lots of airplanes to work with and motorization, they really don't explore it very much. And they don't take the lessons of the far more important Russo-Japanese War seriously. Because in the Russo-Japanese War, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of troops and 100,000 casualties on the Japanese side, a couple of 100,000 on the Russian side, where you see machine guns and barbed wire and artillery and trenches, and these things are completely ignored. And one of the reasons they're ignored is, well, after all, you know, these are Japanese. They're not white people, which of course is absurd today to say such a thing. But at the time, that was one of the attitudes. So they didn't look very carefully at those things, and that was part of the problem when they get to 1914. And by the way, there was no meritocracy when it came to advancing officers. You were very lucky if you got a good officer. In most cases, the officer wasn't terribly interested in what happened. He was busy playing polo or something else. So these things are things that Haldane could not change. Now, when we look at our Army today and the British Army, and one of the reasons I wrote that chapter is that we are very similar. We have an army today where there's almost no one who has had the experience of real warfare. In fact, as I was driving in today with one of the men who was with me in 1991, a mortarman who's sitting over here, he made the same observation. I asked one of the officers who was with me, who later commanded the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, what was your experience in Iraq compared with what you experienced in 91? And he said, a firefight never lasted for more than 2 or 3 minutes. We fought for 6 or 7 hours. The enemy knew that if it stayed for any length of time, it would be annihilated by superior firepower, aircraft, or something else. So we have an army right now that is very similar to the pre-World War I British Army. And we have a lot of people in that army, at the top of the army, who are very reluctant to consider the possibility that they may actually have to fight someone who can fight back. They're very comfortable going to Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, or Southeast Asia, and running training exercises, or what we call live fire exercises with real people. Exercises that don't involve fighting a capable enemy. In fact, I'm personally very concerned right now because we have a lot of those light forces sitting up on the border with Turkey right now, and the Turkish army has massed 50,000 troops on the other side. And the Turks have hundreds of tanks and thousands of guns and are extremely competent. And if they were to intervene and we happen to be in the way when they decide to exterminate the Kurds, we're going to lose a lot of people because we're not prepared for any of it. So we're in a very bad situation right now. When it comes to the idea of volunteers or professional versus the citizen soldier, that's another issue. The problem we have today is that the level of competence, the level of training that's required, the quality of the human capital that you need is so high that anyone who doesn't serve for at least 3 to 4 years is probably not going to bring much value to you in a war, because it's that complex. The technology is that demanding. The training is that demanding. And of course, that means that if you're only going to have an army of 500,000 or less, you've got to make some tough decisions about what you're going to build and maintain, because you have 70,000 men in Special Operations Command. You have 250,000 Marines. Or excuse me, 180,000 Marines. You put the two together, you have 250,000 Marines and soldiers, airmen, sailors. They're all committed to low intensity conflict. That's what they do. So the question is, if that entire vast array of manpower and equipment is committed to low intensity warfare, what are you doing with the Army? Because you have to take another 110,000 out of the Army right away for institutional training and this kind of business. You end up with, we have 190,000 soldiers in 40 countries right now performing these low intensity warfare tasks. That leaves you with maybe 150 to 170,000 troops. That's it. That's all you've got here sitting in the United States with which you could actually build a fighting force. And we're not doing it. Absolutely not doing it.
I appreciate what you're saying in terms of a large fighting force, but it seems like in modern wars, these large fighting forces have been ineffective against guerrilla wars, starting with Vietnam, looking at Iraq, the Second War, not Desert Storm, Afghanistan, 17 years we've been there, 15 years, whatever it is, Iraq, as I mentioned. So what does the accumulation of a large military force, what's the benefit of that in terms of these types of guerrilla wars against the Taliban or whomever?
Did I argue for a large force?
I thought so.
No. Nowhere in the book, and I'm not arguing for one now. I'm arguing for a much better, more lethal professional force. But let's attack your question because it's a very important one. Back to purpose, method, end state. The men who took you into Vietnam in 1965, convinced each other. In fact, we have letters from McGeorge Bundy and McNamara writing to each other saying, well, we may not win in Vietnam, but we know it's the morally right thing to do. We have hundreds of people in Washington right now who are saying, well, we know that we may not win this long war, and we've had lots of mistakes and it hasn't gone well, but staying in Afghanistan and staying in Iraq and getting into Syria is the morally right thing to do. No one in 1965 and no one in 2003, no one in 1991 said, what's the purpose of this? What are we trying to do? Well, we were initially told, for instance, in Afghanistan, that we went in there to deal with about 500 to 600 people, led by someone called Osama bin Laden. We failed. We didn't kill him. We did not destroy those people. They escaped into Pakistan. How could that happen? We spend billions of dollars to maintain the National Security Agency. We spend billions on Special Operations Command. We have satellites following rodents on the side of the road. Well, how could this possibly happen? And then why didn't we deploy any troops on the ground quickly to ensure they could not escape? Where was the Army? Where was the Marine Corps? Why weren't they there? Who is responsible for this debacle? Was he relieved? No. And the man who was responsible for that failure was Tommy Franks. And the Chief of Staff of the Army said, I'm not sending any troops. I can't send anything for at least 6 months, and I'm not sending just a few hundred. I have to send an entire division, and then I have to send an entire Corps headquarters. That's the way we do business. So that was failure number one. Failure number two comes in 2003, and since I was part of that failure and planned the advance on Baghdad for Secretary Rumsfeld, I can speak pretty authoritatively on the subject. I was brought in because the generals wanted what I call the million-man march to Baghdad. And of course, I had seen a lot of action with my unit in 1991, and I went in there and I said, look, most of these Arabs are not going to fight very hard. They're not terribly interested in fighting very hard. They particularly don't care about Saddam Hussein. You know, the old expression, all politics are local, that Tip O'Neill used to swing around. Well, in the Middle East, everything is local. And I said, what we really need to do is get to Baghdad very quickly, ignore everything en route, get there quickly and get Saddam and this crowd. And we had special operators who were supposed to help do that. And then we put a new group of generals in power. And Rumsfeld agreed. Other people thought that was the right thing to do. And then tell them to tell the UN when they're going to hold elections at some point in the distant future. But the Iraqi army had to be rapidly reconstituted or kept intact. Because one of the things that we learned in Afghanistan was that if you had a trash bag full of cash, the people you just fought for a little cash were happy to join up and go with you. And that avoided a lot of trouble. We could have done the same thing with the Iraqi army. Now, a decision was then made much further down the road, primarily as a result of Mr. Wolfowitz, or Dr. Wolfowitz's influence with President Bush. He walked into the office and said, Mr. President, we have an unusual opportunity here. And he had President Cheney with him. We have the opportunity to build the first liberal democracy in the Arab world that will be friendly to Israel. Well, if you believe that, I've got swampland all over the planet that I'd like to sell you. And by the way, I made that comment and I was told, you're a racist because you're suggesting that the Arabs can't maintain an effective liberal democracy. And I said, it has nothing to do with race. It has to do with thousands of years of culture, the nature of these people, tribalism, right down the line. And we have a central government. It's the Iraqi army and administration. Under a new group of generals, we can hold the place together. If you remove it, we're in a lot of trouble. I wasn't the only one. But I would have nothing to do with the occupation because I said it's a disaster and it will produce nothing but disaster for the region, for us. And so I was thanked for my interest in national defense, retired as a colonel in 2004. My point to you is that those decisions were decisions from which it was almost impossible to recover. Occupations, in the words of Genghis Khan, turn soldiers into jailers. You don't want to occupy anything, particularly in that part of the world, when you are viewed, whether you wear an American uniform, a British uniform, doesn't matter, you're a European Christian force trying to occupy a Muslim people. Impossible. Can't be done. It's a prescription for catastrophe. But that was what we did. Now, the second part is that once we did it, just before I retired, I was called to the Hill, and I sat with members of the House Armed Services Committee, wanted my views on this place called Fallujah. Remember that? It broke out in April and May. And they said, what do you think we should do? And I said, bring every tank, bring every gun, and systematically reduce Fallujah, block by block. Oh, well, we could never do that. We would hurt these civilians and everything else. And I said, well, then withdraw. Because if you do not crush this demonstrably in a very brutal and open way, it will get worse. And our soldiers, God bless them, sailors, Marines, airmen, have operated under extremely restrictive rules of engagement. If they think there is any chance of anyone being harmed anywhere, the chain of command says no. No strike, no action, pull out. You can't do that if you intend to fundamentally change something. And we all know now that if you take a lot of casualties on one day, what do the American people do? They say, what are we doing? This is ridiculous. And you know what? The American people are right. It is ridiculous. And we need to get out of all of these places as quickly as possible, because we need to take this force and change it. It has to be prepared for this unknown, inevitable war of decision. And I'm not here to tell you that I think we should fight in future wars. You're looking at someone whose families have... Look, my ancestors have fought in all these wars all the way back into the 18th century. And I can tell you, nobody wanted to. Everybody was opposed, all right? And World War I was a disaster. World War II was a disaster. Look at the map. At the beginning, I cover this in the introduction to Margin of Victory. Look at the map in 1939, then look at the map in 1945. Not just of Europe, of the world. You tell me who won that war. We didn't win that war. Stalin and communism won that war. Because once again, there was no purpose, method, end state thinking. There was no strategy involved. And we have a bad habit of asking hard questions when it's almost over. So what I would ask you to do now is to reconsider some of your assumptions, because if I had been in command and given the task of taking Fallujah, I'd have taken Fallujah. It would have been brutal. We'd have gone block by block. And when it was over, we'd have taken photographs and distributed them across the Middle East and said, if you shoot at another American soldier, this is your fate. Nobody wanted that, because the Americans rightly concluded, what's the strategic interest that justifies that? We didn't have it. And that's my bottom line. But when you go into these wars of decision, there are strategic interests at stake. We captured half of Europe. We saved Japan from communist occupation. That was very important, because those were critical scientific industrial centers. We prevented those from falling into the hands of Stalin. That gave us the edge. We won the Cold War as a result. We waited out the Russians. They collapsed on their own. But the point is that scientific industrial centers of the world count. Germany, Japan are still vitally important in a strategic sense. If they move to an opposing alliance, we're in a lot of trouble.
This is Marvin Weidman Jr., and he's asking, many other nations have watched us for 30 years and learned. As you have now said, they also have gained some of the same capabilities we have. Yet they don't necessarily have the same experience. What can we say our enemies desire to gain in facing us in open warfare as we are training today?
Well, I would tell Marvin the following. In 1914, the British Expeditionary Force was arguably the most experienced military force on the European continent. They had seen more action, had seen more battles, more enemies than anyone else. The problem was that the experience was of no value against the Germans. The Germans had not fought anyone since 1871. So they, by the standards of the day, had no experience. Yet the Germans were vastly better prepared. and administered a stunning series of reverses to the British. So I would say that our experience of the last 15 years, for the reasons that I've outlined to the previous gentleman, and for the reasons I just cited, are of very limited value. Quite frankly, they're not going to save us in the next war.
Sir, what was more effective for the Red Army? The artillery or the Katyushas, the array of rockets which the Germans called Stalinorgel?
You know, I don't know that I could distinguish it. The rockets were always effective because they terrorized the troops that were opposing them. If you were caught in the open, they did a lot of damage. If you were in a dug-in position or in an armored vehicle, less damage, obviously. The artillery was effective with the rockets because they were able to concentrate great numbers and deliver it within a small area. That was really the essence of the Soviet achievement. By the way, the Germans were the ones from whom the Soviets took the inspiration to do that, because the Germans had achieved that by the end of World War I.
Would a good strategic goal be simply that in a lot of these countries should not be used as a base for attack against the United States or any of the Western democratic countries as a sanctuary? Should that really be our strategic goal in these wars?
Well, that was allegedly a goal in 2001 in Afghanistan. We have to go in there to prevent this from being used as a base, but what people don't realize is that experienced Central Intelligence Agency operatives who had spent years in Pakistan and Afghanistan advised us that for a good practical amount of gold, that the Taliban would help sell Osama bin Laden and his friends to us. We chose not to do that. We chose to essentially do the opposite of what the British did. When the British ruled this empire with very few people, a quarter of the world's landmass and population, they were very successful, but they always practiced economy of enemies. Don't fight anyone you don't have to fight. We did the opposite. Don't you remember? You're with us or against us. No one bothered to consider the possibility that you're with us or you're neutral or you don't matter, because we hadn't very narrowly defined the enemy. Had we done that, I think we would have been successful and out of Afghanistan in short order. There's nothing in Afghanistan.
I'm confused. What exactly is our mission in Afghanistan?
Well, you just hit the nail on the head. As I was telling the gentleman earlier, the mission initially was to eliminate Osama bin Laden and the few hundred jihadists that were part of his entourage, if you will, his force up there, and to eliminate his centrality to the Al-Qaeda network. That changed over time because we had people that decided this was a wonderful opportunity for us to transform various Afghan tribesmen, Arabs, and others into Anglo-Saxon Democrats. And after all, you know, remember Condoleezza Rice, the Bush administration? You hear it now all the time from the left. They all agree in Washington on one thing: American values are universal, right? Wrong. No. In fact, when people say, well, we're an exceptional nation, I always say, yes, we're so exceptional, you can't export it. It works here, but it's not going to work everywhere. And so how do you get out of this sort of blind alley of what I call national narcissism? Because that was the problem in 1914. The British had concluded that because they had this great navy and they had this wonderful professional army, small though it was, and that they were the richest people in the world, that there was nothing they could not do. They would beat the Hun. Britain came out of World War I a loser. 1 in 6 British men was killed on the battlefield. The numbers of wounded are just beyond belief. The country went deeply into debt to us. We sustained ourselves through the Depression with payments in gold from Britain and France. They were bankrupt. The French president said, when he was asked how long will this war last in August 1914, he said, well, 6 months. They said, how do you know? Well, that's when we run out of money. But Woodrow Wilson helped them, and the war continued. So my point is that my fear is that we're very much more like the British in the sense that we have an irrational picture of ourselves. We see ourselves as more powerful in reality than we are. We tend to underestimate people who are different from ourselves. And we overestimate our wealth. And all of this could go the way of the British Empire very, very quickly if we're not careful. And that's why in the last part of the book, I talk about the criticality of a foreign policy strategy that looks at what I call limited liability partners. Stop looking at the world as black and white. Everyone is not always, that you don't like is not necessarily enemy, and everyone else is not necessarily your friend. It's all about interests. And you want to try, to the extent that you can, to avoid conflict. Because if you get into it, and you don't have this purpose, method, end state, you don't have a strategic mindset, you very rapidly discover you have limited resources. And those resources run out very quickly. That's what the British found out in World War I. The French found it out. We don't want to go down that path.
So you said that the Japanese army didn't really decide to take in the reforms until like 42 and 43. But they did lose pretty badly to the Russians in 1940. So do you think that, what do you think spurs on like change to create these reforms? Does it take just a ton of defeats, or is there something greater that spurs on these changes?
You've asked the $90,000 question. If we only had the answer. Normally, significant losses, significant defeat is the principal catalyst for change, unfortunately. There are exceptions. In the case of the Japanese in 1939, the battle that you're referring to, they lost to the Russians, but the Japanese Air Force shot the Soviet Air Force out of the air. Very few people know that. The problem was that it didn't make any difference how good the Japanese pilots were in their aircraft. The Japanese army was an infantry-centric army. They had very few tanks, very few large caliber guns, and what they did have was old. It was sort of post World War I vintage, nothing new. The Soviets rolled in there with very modern equipment by the standards of the day, and they smashed the army on the ground. They lost the battle in the air. Now, after that happened, there was a decision, well, we'll give up this idea of conquering eastern Siberia for a while, which was really the Japanese agenda, and we'll move south into the Pacific, where we have lots of weak opponents. And so Japan spreads across the Pacific, where she does, in fact, have weak opponents. And this illusion of military supremacy, the illusion of great power persists. And the consequences for Japan are catastrophic.
Sir, what's your wish list, real high level, in terms of reconstituting naval power, ground forces, air power, intelligence, reconnaissance for the United States? What would you offer up as? I think maybe you've got a point up there about this joint ISR strike maneuver sustainment framework. What does that constitute? What would it look like?
Well, first of all, we are desperately in need of a serious strategic review. Not by the usual suspects inside the Beltway, by the way, but by people who are brought in from the outside to look at the force structure. We've talked a lot here about casualties. We haven't talked very much in the time that I'm here about time and space. In 1914, you were looking at a front of perhaps 10, 15 miles, a depth of maybe 2 or 3 miles to your front. By the time you get to Shanghai, you're talking about a front of 100 miles. And you're looking 100, 150 miles into China. This time-space relationship continues to change and expand dramatically. By the time you get to Desert Storm, we're really subjecting Iraq to what I would call global envelopment. Forces are coming from every direction around the world, essentially orchestrated with space-based assets and technology to converge on a particular place and then against various target arrays. That's the revolutionary change. Today, we have done absolutely nothing to deal with the reality that most of the forces we have are still trained, organized, and equipped on the 1942 model. We haven't come to terms with the reality that one multiple rocket launcher called a Smerch, Soviet, vintage originally, now Russian, they can cover with just one volley of rockets from one launcher an area the size of Central Park. And everything in Central Park will risk being demolished. These battalions in the Russian army are now sought after by everyone. The Iranians want them, the Turks want them, the Chinese have got something like it. But the point is, these are weapons of mass destruction. They're weapons of mass destruction, and they're worse than nuclear weapons in the sense that they're very accurate. Nuclear weapons were really designed to deal with inaccuracy. You wanted something big to explode over a large area because you weren't sure that you could absolutely hit it. Today, nuclear weapons really aren't necessary. You can do all the damage you want with these weapons. And then there is the over-reliance in the U.S. Armed Forces on not just space-based surveillance, but too much direction from above, and a failure to build in redundancy to deal with the probability of losing from time to time your access to those overhead surveillances. Today, any of the aircraft that we have, even the ones we've spent the most money on, are going to have a great deal of difficulty surviving integrated air defenses on the Russian and Chinese model. This is what people keep referring to as anti-access capabilities. These are profound, and they are everywhere. And today, any surface vessel that moves close to the coast, within 200 nautical miles of the coast, is at tremendous risk. You're going to see oceans that are going to be as empty as battlefields. So you've got to have forces that can disperse so they don't present targets. They all have to be mobile, because the days of digging in and fighting it out are over. You dig in, you're identified, you're targeted, you're eliminated. So you have to have mobility. You absolutely have to armor up most of your ground force. If you try to dismount large numbers of people, they won't survive the lethality out there. And again, these are the issues that have to be addressed that have been missed, if you will, over the last 15 to 16 years completely. They haven't been missed overseas by potential opponents, but we've missed them entirely. So the best I can give you right now is that we need that kind of review so that we can make some tough decisions. And nobody likes tough decisions in peacetime, even in war. But we've got to make some, because we're reaching the point where we simply can't afford to spend on the scale that we have. Remember, we've lost $3 trillion. $3 trillion added to the national sovereign debt. And we're still spending almost $600 billion with a $19 billion plus up. This can't go on. Remember, defense spending represents 50% of your discretionary spending. And our defense spending is equal to the defense spending in the entire world on any given day. Just add it all up and you get the US defense budget. Where does it all go? Well, it's not necessarily going where it needs to go. So you've got to have a review. And the last time we had a serious review was under Eisenhower. And that's because Eisenhower had been in the military and he knew damn well what was going on in the Pentagon, and he said, we need a review. And it was a lot of pain in the Pentagon, but it worked, and we saved a lot of money.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yes.